The first thing I noticed was how cold the courtroom felt. Maybe it wasn't the temperature, but the way every whisper died as I walked in. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white. My brother Marcus sat across the room with his wife Victoria, both of them dressed like they were going to a magazine photo shoot instead of trying to dismantle my life. Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice dripping with practiced concern. We're here because we love Clara, and we're worried for her well-being. He glanced at me as if I were some fragile creature. She hasn't been herself since leaving her post. We have documented psychiatric evaluations that suggest she's become mentally unstable. I felt my jaw tighten. Those evaluations were fake. I hadn't seen a psychiatrist in years. Marcus handed the judge a stack of papers with an ease that made my stomach turn. He had always been good at looking trustworthy. Victoria leaned forward, her pearl earrings catching the light. We're not doing this for ourselves, she added softly. We're doing this for her. Clara needs someone to manage her finances before things get worse. I wanted to laugh. Victoria had never cared about me. Only the money I earned and the recognition I received when I was still the emergency response chief. I looked at her, remembering all the times she had smiled at me through gritted teeth. Marcus played his final card, a video. The screen lit up with footage of me kneeling in the mud at a disaster site, holding the hand of a dying firefighter. My voice cracked as I called for help in that recording. It was one of the worst moments of my life, now edited to look like a breakdown. See? Marcus said, shaking his head. She's been erratic, delusional even. We're concerned she might do something dangerous. Clara believes people are stealing from her. She has financial delusions. I didn't speak. Not yet. I let him talk, let him spin his web, every lie making the silence heavier. The judge finally turned to me. Miss Whitman, do you have anything to say in response to these claims? For a second, I just stared at Marcus, wondering if he could see the hatred behind my calm expression. No words, Clara? He asked with a smirk, like he'd already won. I reached for the envelope sitting beside me, heavy, sealed, and ready. I slid it across the table without saying a word. The faint sound of the paper gliding on wood seemed to cut through the tension. The judge picked it up, curious. Marcus shifted in his seat. What's in that? He demanded, his confident tone faltering. I finally met his eyes. Why don't we find out? I said quietly. The judge broke the seal, and for the first time all morning, Marcus stopped smiling. The first time I drove back to my parents' neighborhood after retiring, I felt a strange mix of pride and dread. For over 2 decades, I had managed disaster logistics across the country, leading teams through hurricanes, wildfires, and floods. I had been the one people called when everything was falling apart. But as I turned onto the street where I grew up, I had no idea my own life was about to unravel. The house looked different. Not the home I remembered with its weathered porch swing and chipped blue shutters. The lawn was freshly manicured, the shutters now white. A sleek for sale sign stood in the front yard with a bright red sticker across it, sold. I parked and stared at the sign, confusion turning to panic. When I stepped out of the car, Marcus was already waiting on the porch, arms crossed, wearing that fake, sympathetic smile he'd perfected. Clara, he said smoothly, like we were just catching up. You're home sooner than I expected. What's going on? I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. Why is there a sold sign? This is Mom and Dad's house. He sighed as if I were a child asking too many questions. It's not theirs anymore. We sold it, under your name. I blinked. Under my name? Marcus, I never signed anything. You did, he said, his tone shifting just slightly. You were in rehab for that injury last year, remember? You don't recall signing the deed transfer? I remembered the rehab facility vividly, the endless days of physical therapy after the warehouse collapsed during Hurricane Ellen, but I would have remembered signing away my parents' house. My gut twisted. Marcus was lying, and I could tell because his eyes darted to the left, the same subtle tick he'd had since we were kids. I don't believe you, I said flatly. Victoria appeared in the doorway, dressed like she was about to film a commercial for empathy. Clara, sweetie, you've been through so much. It's no wonder you don't remember. Maybe we should talk to someone? Like a therapist? Her tone was soft, but her eyes were sharp, assessing my reaction. I said nothing. I knew better than to argue with her feigned concern. That was her weapon, pretending to help while pulling the rug out from under you. As we stood there, she stepped closer and placed a hand on my arm. You're still recovering, she said. We've scheduled some sessions for you just to help you process things. We even have transcripts to show how worried you've been about your finances." That's when it hit me. The transcripts weren't real. They were setting me up, creating a trail of fake evidence to make me look unstable. They wanted everything: my accounts, my records, maybe even my identity. "You're not just after the house," I said slowly. "This is about all of it, isn't it? You're trying to take everything from me." Marcus smiled, the same way he used to smile before pushing me into a lie when we were kids. "You're imagining things, Clara. You need rest. We'll handle everything." I turned to look at the house one last time, realizing the betrayal wasn't just financial. It was personal, calculated, and I had no idea just how deep his motives went. A few days after confronting Marcus about the house, I found myself sitting in my small apartment, surrounded by boxes of old field reports and mission logs. I hadn't opened those files in years. Most people retire to forget the chaos they've seen, but now I needed to remember everything. The first clue came from a simple name on an old invoice: Whitman Logistics, LLC. It wasn't mine, but it carried my last name. Marcus had used it to bid on government contracts during Hurricane Ellen, back when I was overseeing supply distribution. Something about that name scratched at the back of my mind like a splinter. I started digging through old manifests, searching for discrepancies. That's when I saw it. A series of shipments marked "delivered" that never made it to the shelters. The dates lined up with Marcus's sudden jump in wealth. It was subtle, buried under layers of paperwork, but I could see it now with a clarity that made my stomach turn. A memory hit me like a punch to the chest, a flashback from that mission. We had set up a temporary triage center near the Gulf, working with limited resources. A young first responder named Kyle, barely 21, collapsed from exhaustion after going days without proper food or medical supplies. I remember kneeling beside him, holding his hand as he struggled to breathe. The doctors told me later that if they'd had the proper IV kits and electrolyte packs, he might have survived. And now, looking at the forged documents, I realized those missing supplies had Marcus's fingerprints all over them. I leaned back in my chair, my hands trembling. The betrayal was no longer just about the house or my bank accounts. It was about the lives lost because someone like Marcus saw a disaster as a chance to make money. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Kyle's face, the way his eyes had searched mine for reassurance as I told him help was coming, when deep down I wasn't sure if it was. The guilt I'd carried for years suddenly sharpened into anger. The next morning, I drove to the old Emergency Operations Center, now a quiet government building with faded lettering. I asked to see archived records from Hurricane Ellen. The clerk hesitated, but when I flashed my retired ID badge, she let me in. In a dusty back room, I combed through digital logs and hard copies of supply routes. The deeper I went, the worse it looked. GPS trackers showed that several shipments meant for devastated towns had been rerouted to private warehouses linked to Marcus's company. It was all there, buried under fake signatures and altered timestamps. I took photos of every document, my heart pounding with every click of my phone camera. The pieces were falling into place, and the story they told made me sick. Marcus hadn't just betrayed me. He had stolen from the very people I had sworn to protect. Standing there, surrounded by files that smelled of old ink and mildew, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: clarity. This wasn't just about my family anymore. This was about justice. And I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Once I knew what Marcus had done, I couldn't unsee it. Every lie he told me, every concerned look Victoria gave, it was all part of a bigger plan. But I also knew that if I made one wrong move, they'd twist it to make me look unhinged. They'd already started building that narrative. I needed solid, undeniable evidence. For the next week, my dining table became a war room. Stacks of supply manifests, altered invoices, and GPS logs spread across every inch. I cross-referenced everything, building a timeline of how Marcus's company had siphoned off supplies during the hurricane. The data didn't lie. Trucks had taken detours that didn't match official routes. Shipments were marked as delivered with no signed receipts, and footage from relief centers confirmed certain supplies never arrived. I found an old hard drive from my field laptop, one I hadn't touched since retiring. Buried in a folder labeled Ops_backup, I discovered videos I'd recorded during Hurricane Ellen. One clip showed me standing with Kyle's team, panicking over the lack of medical supplies. My own voice cracked as I listed items that were supposed to be on that last truck. It wasn't proof of Marcus directly, but it established that the missing shipments were a deadly problem. Still, I needed more. That's when I called Elise Durant, my former deputy director. We hadn't spoken in almost a year, but when I explained what I'd found, she didn't hesitate. "Clara, this is federal-level fraud," she said firmly. "If you have hard evidence, I can connect you with someone who'll take this seriously." "Elise, I'm not sure how far Marcus will go if he realizes I'm coming for him," I admitted. "Then we don't give him the chance," she replied. "I'll bring in Captain Rowan. He's with internal investigations now. He's good, and he'll believe you if the evidence holds." 2 days later, Rowan and I met at a quiet diner off the interstate. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with the calm presence of someone who'd seen every kind of disaster and betrayal. He listened without interrupting as I laid out the documents, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay composed. Rowan tapped one of the manifests with a finger. "This isn't just fraud, Clara. This is tampering with federal relief records. If you're ready to make this public, we can build a case. But I need to know, are you prepared to sever all ties with your brother?" I hesitated, staring down at my coffee. "I don't think I ever really had a brother to begin with," I said quietly. He nodded. "Then we start here." That night, I compiled everything into a single dossier. Copies of manifests, screenshots of GPS data, the video logs, and a list of fake invoices connected to Marcus's company. I sealed it in an envelope, the same kind I would later slide across the courtroom table. I knew this was the point of no return. The second hearing felt different from the first. The tension was still there, thick and heavy, but I no longer felt cornered. I had something they didn't: the truth, sealed in the envelope that now sat in the judge's hands. Marcus stood confidently at his table, his lawyer flipping through papers like they had already won. Victoria sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his forearm, the picture of a supportive wife. I recognized the act for what it was: rehearsed, calculated. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his tone dripping with false sincerity, "this has gone on long enough. Clara needs professional care. We're only asking for what's best for her and for everyone's safety." The judge glanced at me. "Miss Whitman, do you have a response before we proceed with this petition?" I stayed seated, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "I believe everything you need is in that envelope, Your Honor." Marcus scoffed. "Another dramatic gesture? She's clearly not thinking rationally." "Mr. Whitman," the judge interrupted, "you will remain silent until I ask for your input." The bailiff handed the envelope to the judge, who broke the seal and started reading. The room went silent except for the rustling of paper. His brow furrowed after just a few lines, and soon his expression hardened. He looked up at Marcus, then at Victoria. "These documents," the judge began slowly, "detail extensive fraud, identity theft, and evidence tampering tied to federal disaster relief operations. They are accompanied by supporting records and signed witness statements. Miss Whitman, are these allegations verified?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said firmly. "Captain Rowan and a federal investigative team have reviewed every piece of evidence." As if on cue, the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 12 federal investigators entered, Captain Rowan leading them. The sound of their boots against the floor echoed like a drumbeat of finality. The judge nodded to them. "Captain Rowan," he said, "do you confirm these charges?" Rowan stepped forward, his voice steady. "We do, Your Honor. We have a warrant for the arrest of Marcus Whitman for fraud, identity theft, and tampering with federal records. We also have pending inquiries into Victoria Whitman's involvement." Victoria's face went pale, her composure cracking for the first time. "This is absurd! You can't—" "Mrs. Whitman," the judge snapped, "sit down or you will be removed." Marcus tried to stand, but Rowan's team was already on him, pulling his hands behind his back and snapping on the cuffs. His face twisted with anger, his calm facade shattering. "Clara, you'll regret this," he spat as they let him out. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The same people who had looked at me with pity during the last hearing were now looking at Marcus with disbelief. I sat tall, my hands still steady, feeling neither triumph nor relief. Only the quiet weight of truth finally revealed. The headlines hit the next morning. My phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, messages, and calls I had no interest in answering. Whitman family fraud exposed. Former emergency chief Clara Whitman uncovers supply chain scandal. Some called me a hero. Others implied I had known all along and waited too long to speak up. The mix of praise and doubt left me feeling oddly numb. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the news feed while a half-drunk cup of coffee went cold. Every article mentioned Marcus's arrest, listing the charges like bullet points in a resume of corruption. My name was there too. but always as the whistleblower, never just as Clara. I wasn't sure which version of me the world saw anymore. A few former colleagues called. Some congratulated me. "You saved lives by coming forward," one woman said, her voice shaky with emotion, but others were colder. "Why didn't you speak up during the mission?" one man asked, his tone almost accusatory. I had no answer for that. Maybe I'd been too buried in logistics, or maybe I just hadn't wanted to believe my own brother was capable of something so vile. I spent most of that week in silence, letting the weight of everything settle on my shoulders. I thought about the families who had gone without supplies, the responders who had risked everything while Marcus stole from them. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kyle, the young responder who had died on my watch. His face wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a reminder of the cost of my silence. Late one night, I found myself sitting on my apartment floor, surrounded by boxes of my old uniforms and medals. There was no sense of victory in them anymore. They were just relics of a version of me that I wasn't sure I could ever be again. I thought about Marcus, sitting in a cell somewhere, probably blaming me for his downfall. The truth was, I felt no satisfaction in seeing him locked up. He had been my brother once, the boy who'd stolen cookies with me from the kitchen, the teenager who'd driven me to my first job interview. Somewhere along the way, that boy had vanished. The world saw me as strong, but inside, I felt hollow. Exposing Marcus hadn't brought me peace. It had simply uncovered the rot that had been festering for years, both in my family and in me. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel like a victim either. I just felt responsible. And I knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. It was nearly 3 weeks after the hearing when I found the letter in my mailbox. The envelope was a pale cream color, the kind people use for wedding invitations or carefully worded apologies. My name was written in a familiar, sharp cursive, Victoria's handwriting. For a long moment, I just stood there on my porch, the letter pinched between my fingers. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what she had to say. Curiosity won out, though. I carried it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and slit it open with a butter knife. "Clara," it began, "I know I am the last person you want to hear from. I can't undo what Marcus did, and I can't undo the part I played. I wish I could say I didn't know how deep his schemes ran, but I can't. The truth is I suspected something but didn't ask questions because I liked the life we had. I liked the comfort. Maybe that makes me worse than him." I paused, the words digging under my skin. I could almost hear her voice, soft and deliberate, the way she always spoke when trying to avoid direct blame. The letter went on. "I've refiled the deed. Your parents' house is yours again. I signed over everything Marcus put in my name. I don't expect forgiveness. In fact, I'm certain I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that I won't fight this. I have nothing left to gain, and I am no longer considered family by your standards or mine." There was no apology in the letter. Not really. She admitted to being complicit, but her tone was detached, like she was already separating herself from the wreckage Marcus left behind. At the bottom, she'd signed simply, "Victoria." Attached was a manila folder containing copies of the property documents. It was all real. The house I had grown up in was back under my name. A gesture meant to make things right, I supposed, but it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a door closing. I leaned back in my chair, the letter resting on the table. Memories of Victoria flooded my mind. Family barbecues where she smiled too wide. Holidays where she tried to outshine everyone in the room. For years, I'd believed her concern for me was real, but now I saw it for what it was, a mask to hide her ambition. Instead of anger, what I felt was something quieter, almost like acceptance. There was no going back. Marcus was gone, and Victoria, even with her letter and legal filings, would never be family again. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope. The house was mine again, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of a chapter I'd been forced to finish. The invitation to Washington, D.C. came in a crisp white envelope with the emblem of the Department of Homeland Security stamped on the back. For a moment, I thought it was another bureaucratic notice about the fraud investigation. Instead, it was a formal request for my attendance at a national service ceremony. They were giving me an award for courage and integrity in exposing internal corruption. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay home and let the headlines fade. But another part, the part that remembered every life lost because of Marcus's greed, knew I had to stand there, not for recognition, but to set the record straight. When the day arrived, I stood backstage at the ceremony hall, my heart pounding like I was about to walk into a disaster zone again. Captain Rowan was there, his calm presence a steady anchor. He gave me a small nod. "You've done more than most people would ever dare," he said quietly. "It's time you got credit for that." I stepped onto the stage to polite applause. The lights were bright, and for a second I felt exposed, like every scar from every mission was on display. A large banner behind me read, "Service above self." It felt strange to see those words and know they now applied to me, not just to the teams I had once led. The host introduced me, recounting my career and the investigation I had sparked. I kept my face neutral, though my stomach tightened with every mention of Marcus. When it was my turn to speak, I walked up to the podium, gripping the sides to steady my voice. "I'm honored," I began, glancing at the audience of officials, first responders, and investigators. "But this isn't about me. It's about the truth. We all know that justice isn't revenge. It's the act of restoring what's right, even when it costs you everything. I didn't come forward to hurt anyone, even my own family. I did it because the truth was bigger than me, bigger than all of us." The room was silent, the kind of silence that told me people were actually listening. I didn't give a long speech. I never liked the sound of my own voice. I simply said, "If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Silence can protect the wrong people. It's what you do after the silence that matters." When I stepped off the stage, Rowan was waiting, holding the small medal they had given me. "You did good," he said with a rare smile. I wasn't sure if I felt proud or just lighter. As I left the ceremony hall, I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was the turning point. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't defined by betrayal or loss. I was just Clara Whitman again. The day I signed the papers to buy back my parents' old property, the house was still empty, its windows clouded with dust. Standing in the front yard, I felt the weight of the years pressing down, the memories of childhood laughter, the endless fights, and the way Marcus had stripped it all away with a signature forged in my name. Taking it back wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming something that still mattered. I didn't want to live there, though. The house had too many ghosts. Instead, I saw a different future for the land. A space for people like me, veterans of chaos and crisis, who needed a place to breathe again. I named it the Listening Post. The idea started small, just a quiet retreat for a few old colleagues who were still battling nightmares from the disasters we'd survived together. But once I mentioned it to Elise Durant, she said, "Clara, this is bigger than you think. People need this. We all need a place where silence doesn't feel like failure." I hired a small team to help renovate the property. The old house was torn down, replaced with a modern lodge built from cedar and glass, open to the surrounding trees. We built cabins with wide porches and large windows that let in the sunlight, and at the heart of it all, a community hall where people could talk, or not talk, as they needed. When construction was finished, I had a wooden sign carved with the name The Listening Post. Beneath it, I had the phrase etched, "Nothing wrong with silence. It's what you do after that defines you." The first group of guests were former responders and veterans, some of them people I'd worked alongside during the worst days of my career. A few brought their families, others came alone, just hoping for a place where the world would stop spinning for a while. I remember the first evening clearly. We all sat on the wide deck, watching the sun sink behind the tree line. No one said much. There were no speeches, no forced conversation, just a quiet, mutual understanding that we were all carrying scars, some visible and some not. One man, a firefighter named Lucas, who had lost 3 friends in a building collapse, walked up to me that night. He didn't say thank you or offer compliments. He just looked at me, nodded once, and whispered, "I needed this." That was enough. The Listening Post wasn't about healing everything. I knew some wounds never close. It was about giving people the space to breathe, to remember they weren't alone. And in building it for others, I realized I was building something for myself too. As I stood by the gate that evening, the wooden sign casting a long shadow in the fading light, I knew I'd finally reclaimed not just the land, but my sense of purpose. The first time I sat behind the microphone, I hesitated. The little red on-air light glowed in the corner of the studio, waiting for me to speak. The station wasn't anything fancy, just a converted room at the Listening Post, with soundproof panels on the walls and an old mixing board Elise had helped me set up. I cleared my throat, my voice sounding strange in the headphones. "This is Clara Whitman," I began. keeping my tone steady. If you're listening, you probably know my story by now. But this isn't about headlines or scandals. It's about survival, about the quiet battles we fight when no one is watching. For a long moment, I let the silence sit there, breathing through the weight of the words. I thought about the people who might be tuning in, the firefighters who'd lost partners, the medics who couldn't sleep because of what they'd seen, the veterans who felt forgotten. They were the reason I was doing this. I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me years ago, I continued. Silence is not surrender. You don't have to explain every wound or justify why you're still here. You don't owe anyone your pain. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't even rehearsed. It was just me talking into the night like I was speaking to a room full of old friends. I told them about the day I realized my brother had betrayed me, how the lies nearly broke me, and how I found the courage to fight back, not for revenge, but for truth. People will tell you to move on, to let things go, I said softly. But moving on doesn't mean staying silent. It means finding your own voice, even when it shakes. I didn't expect anyone to respond. I thought maybe a handful of listeners might catch the broadcast by accident, shrug, and change the station. But by the next morning, my inbox was full. There were emails from veterans in Texas who said my words reminded them they weren't forgotten. A paramedic from New Orleans wrote, "I thought I was the only one who couldn't let go of what I saw." Hearing you talk about it made me feel less alone. Some messages were short, just a single line like, "Thank you for saying it out loud." Others were pages long, filled with stories of loss, resilience, and hope. I read every single one. One night, as I finished reading another batch of emails, I caught myself smiling, a real smile, the kind I hadn't felt in years. For so long, my voice had been drowned out by Marcus's lies, by the noise of the world telling me to be quiet. Now that same voice was reaching people I'd never meet, giving them something I once thought I'd lost: hope. I turned off the mic, the room falling silent again. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was alive, waiting for the next story to be told.